going on, everyone, and welcome to the Curious Raven Chronicles. Today we're at Charles Evans Cemetery in Reading, Pennsylvania. The cemetery was founded in 1846 by Charles Evans. He was a local lawyer and one of Reading's first philanthropists. In 1794, he married the love of his life, Mary Keene, and they were married for 44 years. In the last few years of his life, and just after losing his wife, having no children to inherit his fortune, he was determined to make it possible for the people of Reading to have a non-sectarian cemetery. He purchased and donated 25 acres of land. At the time, the cemetery was a mile away from the city limits, beyond the hustle and the bustle of Reading. He wanted a place where friends and families could linger and reflect. It wasn't uncommon for people to picnic among the graves. He wanted it to be abundantly endowed, free from debt, and eternally cared for and continuously improved. Charles Evans passed away 1 year after founding the cemetery. He willed $10,000 and 3/4 of his estate, which was roughly about $67,000. The most obvious feature of the cemetery is the Sandstone Entrance. It was completed in 1852. It reflects the Gothic Revival style, popular of the time. There is a Tudor-style office building that was built in 1927. It's used for staff and storage. Today, the Charles Evans Cemetery has grown up to 119 acres, and it's the final resting place for many of the area's most influential business people and politicians. It can be considered more than a cemetery. In some ways, it's an art garden or a sculpture garden with very unique, one-of-a-kind pieces throughout the cemetery. They are sculpted by artists from the Philadelphia area and the Reading area, like this one here of Charles Evans, sculpted by Henry Ellicott, who is famous for his Civil War sculptures. A lot of his other work can also be seen in Gettysburg, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. So, let's go to our first stop. So our first stop here is the Rake family Sphinx. James Rake, who was buried here, he passed away of pneumonia in the winter of 1920. He was a prominent businessman, president of the General Asphalt Company. He was a member of many fraternal organizations, such as the Freemasons. He was a member of the Knights of Templar. He was a Grand Commander of the Sons of the Unions, of the Veteran Unions. The Sphinx, it's believed, probably comes from the Masonic emblem. A symbol is a mystery, as a lot of temples might use it for protection. The female Sphinx is of Greek origin, where the male Sphinx is from Egyptian origin. So somewhere along the line, it also got intertwined with the Masons. So James' father, he was Sergeant Benjamin Rake. He's buried here too somewhere. He was part of the Sherman's March to the Sea during the Civil War, during which he was captured actually by the Confederate soldiers. He spent 6 months as a POW. But this is James Lewis Rake, businessman, member of a local Mason temple. Our next stop is here, the grave of Frederick Lauer. As you can see, it's a pyramid. He was a prominent leader in the beer industry. He was born in Germany. His family immigrated here when he was 12 years old. His family opened a brewery in Wilmsdorf, Pennsylvania. And he worked his way through the brewery. At 25, he became the proprietor of the facility. Let's take a look at this. Even the bushes are all nice and trimmed nice here. He was actually the president of the American Brewers Association, and of course fought against Prohibition. He was actually one of the first people to have a statue erected at City Park. In downtown Reading. And a lot like the previous grave we were at, there's a lot of Masonic symbolism here. See above the door. That's it's a winged Egyptian sun. It's usually associated with power and divinity. Got those two snakes on the side. You see the two serpents here. And also on the door. Serpent with those two flames. And it's also, those wings are also a symbol of patriotism. He was known to offer free lunches to Union soldiers when they were in town, in the Reading area, and he was very instrumental in raising volunteers and outfitting some companies from Pennsylvania for the Civil War. That's Frederick Lauer. He's also been known to be the first brewer of lager beer in America before Yingling. So that's Frederick Lauer. We're now at the grave of Charles Augustus Lauer. He was as much of an American hero as they come. He was born in Germany. He took part of a failed German Revolution in 1848. That eventually led him to immigrating to the United States. He had a great education while in Germany, and while in America, he was the civil engineer for the Schuylkill Navigation Company, the Schuylkill Canal. When the Civil War broke out, he enlisted right away and was eventually commissioned as the colonel of the 167th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry. He was wounded in the Battle of Deserted House in southeastern Virginia. He died a few weeks later in battle. This kind of goes over that a little bit. Born in Emmendingen, Germany. He died at Suffolk, Virginia. Wounds received in the action near the Blackwater River. Our country mourns a brave, devoted, and accomplished officer who fell in her service as sacrifice to the wicked rebellion. So yeah, he had a thorough military education. He was a graduate of one of the best polytechnic schools in Europe. He was an accomplished officer and brave soldier. It's a helmet. There's a sword behind it. It was reported that on his deathbed, he was mostly worried about how his regiment was doing. And his wife is here as well, Magdalena. So some of the symbolism here is actually pretty interesting. It was sculpted by a local sculptor and entomologist named Herman Strecker. He was also responsible for another monument we'll be seeing here. So the way the helmet is and the way the sword is coming out is it's depicting that a soldier, and that the placement of the sword is that his death was in battle. And if you look up the column here, it's hard to see because there's actually an American flag draped over it. If you look hard enough, you'll see a star on the American flag. But it's actually an American flag. But if the flag wasn't there, you would see that this column was essentially broken for a life cut too short. Charles Nodder. This next grave, we're at the grave of Marguerite Bouvet. She was born February 14th, Valentine's Day, 1865. She died in 1915. Now, she was born in New Orleans. Her parents were very well distinguished from France, but they lost their fortune during the Civil War. So she was eventually raised for 7 years by her grandparents back in France, in Lyons, France. She came back here and somehow managed to end up in Reading, Pennsylvania. She eventually became an author. She was an authoress here in Reading, writing a lot of children's books. She was also a teacher, but she wrote a lot of children's books way back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. She actually died a very peculiar way. She was actually a resident of the Allentown State Hospital, which is a mental asylum. While there, the articles I read, some say she killed herself on purpose, but the truth came out later that it was an accident. She was apparently, I don't know what kind of condition she had. They never said, and back then they probably didn't know. It was probably something along the lines of perhaps ALS or MS or something like that. But she was paralyzed for an unknown reason. And while she was trying to have her lunch or her breakfast, she apparently choked on a piece of bread that got stuck in her throat and strangled her, essentially. While they were going through her things, they found a poem among all of her manuscripts. It's kind of a neat poem, and this is it right here. It's called The Awakening. The Awakening, high on the throne of my exalted mind, I look above where mountains kiss the sky and dream of an eternal day, the conflict over, the battle done, of sorrow vanquished, victories won. The past enshrouded in the mist sinks far below my rising sun. The morning breaks, my spirit wakes. Lo, I behold the king's pathway. Margaret Bouvet, an author who lived here in Reading, Pennsylvania. Now we're at the grave, or the mausoleum, for William Luden. His name's here, but this isn't his final resting place. He's actually buried in West Laurel Hill down in Philadelphia, but this mausoleum still has his name. He's a local confectioner from Reading, Pennsylvania. He started selling candy in his father's watch and jewelry shop. His business just kept growing and growing, and he started manufacturing the specialty of Luden's cough drops. Actually would develop the Fifth Avenue candy bar as well. But his first wife was buried here, Annie Ritter. I believe an uncle is here as well. William Luden was the owner of the Bon Air Mansion, which eventually became Central Catholic High School. Supposedly haunted. They say by his son who hanged himself, but there's no clear evidence of that ever happening. So it could be haunted, but by who knows? We may never find out. So we're at the grave now of Ferdinand Toom. He was, with a partner of his, he was created some knitting mills in the Wyomissing area, the knitting mills that were over there, which became the VF Outlet, and now it's part of various businesses. But he was the founder of Wyomissing, essentially. This is his grave right here. Pretty neat story. Him and his partner made their own knitting mills, the machines they use. Some of them are still in use today in Reading. If I can find a video, I'll add that here. But more on him in a later video. As the founder of Wyomissing, it's a very interesting story, unique story. His partner's around here somewhere. I haven't found his grave yet. But this is Ferdinand Toone. The Toone Trail, which is a bike trail, hiking trail, was named after him. But early businessman in Pennsylvania. Did a lot for his employees, and creating Wyomissing is like the perfect small town. Ferdinand Toone. Now we're at the grave of one of the most infamous murder-suicides in Reading, Berks County history. It's that of Louisa Bissinger. The story goes that she was a little distraught over the news of her husband and possibly another woman, that they had a really bad argument that day. And he told her he wanted her out of the house, taking 2 of the daughters, leaving the son for himself. She was so distraught that she had a plan that day. It wasn't a good plan. She was seen taking a trolley down Penn Street, across what's now Penn Street Bridge, eventually making her way to the Union Canal. A gentleman named Nicholas Thomas was reported seeing her past the Union Canal office. She remarked about that it was a warm day, and he agreed. He said she appeared distressed looking, as though she had been crying. Witnesses say that the children were gleefully by their mother's side as they picked up rocks along the way, placing them in a basket that she brought with them. She made a game of it, about collecting rocks in their baskets. When she reached lock number 49, she quickly filled the remainder of her basket with rocks, tied it to her waist, tucked her children under her arms, jumped into the waters of the Union Canal, the weight of the rocks pulling them all under. Just a moment, they were brought to eternity. Mother, Molly, Lily, Philip, and she was pregnant. In the days following, people wondered who could do such a thing. Stories started manifesting that her marriage wasn't great and that her husband was mistreating her. Some stories indicate he offered her the money to leave, with the conclusion that jealousy and grief led her to murder her children and kill herself. This created a lot of excitement in the city. And on the day of the funeral, which when they buried the bodies, they just dug one big trench here and just put the bodies side by side in the trench. The newspaper had said that there was well over 4,000 to 7,000 people in the cemetery and on the way to the cemetery. There was animosity towards her husband to the point that he needed a police escort to the cemetery. He needed bodyguards. There's some reports in the newspaper that there were some gunshots, but another article said that that was not true. But there were women in the cemetery who were not very happy about the situation and yelled out that they should hang him. After that, the police soon got him back in the carriage and got him back home. So Louisa Bissinger is also a very popular haunting along the Union Canal towpath, which is now a bike trail, hiking trail. But also, they've been known to be here, both Louisa and her husband Philip. Philip he started the Reading Brewing Company about 15 years after Louisa passed away. He remarried again, and she's buried here too. Husband and wife. Her husband's been known to be here too. A lot of times when you're here with equipment, he might interfere for fear of the story being known. What also happened the days after the funeral is that her brother, I suppose the Reading Eagle, the newspapers were a lot like social media at the time. The brother wrote a nice little piece for the Reading Eagle. I don't have it with me or I'd read it, accusing him of being mean to her, being rude to her, and that he was responsible for her death. And a couple days later, Philip wrote his own article describing his innocence. But that is the story of Louisa Bissinger. We're now at the grave of Matilda Edwards Strong. She was the daughter of an Illinois politician. Apparently at some point she caught the attention of Abraham Lincoln. Her family states that Lincoln at one time actually proposed to her. Look at that bird, the dove on the side. Mary Todd Lincoln also mentioned the proposal in one of her early biographies of President Lincoln. There's a weeping willow tree here, one here. It's said that Lincoln actually called off his engagement to Mary Todd in January, and Mary Todd was blaming Matilda for that. But Matilda didn't accept his proposal. Instead, she married William Strong, who's also buried here as well. He was a lawyer. He served in the Congress and also served as a U.S. Supreme Court. He's here as well. Unfortunately, Matilda died of a young age. She was 29. She was in Philadelphia, and she suddenly collapsed and passed away. Now again, you can see at the foot of the grave and at the head of the grave, there's some weeping willow trees. Symbolizes grief and mourning. There's a wreath here. And there's also a wreath on top. They're floral wreaths. They generally indicate a victory over death or a victory of redemption. And you can see the dove here. And a draping going across it as well. It's pretty cool. But this is Matilda Strong. Caught the eye of Abraham Lincoln at some point. Finishing up this tour at the grave of James Cornett and his family. James passed away suddenly at the age of 17. In his obituary, it said he passed away of heart disease, leaving behind his parents and 3 sisters. His parents, Lily and Charles. You can see Charles and James both died in the same year. Friends of his father Charles said he was despondent ever since he lost his son. Just after 1 on September 20th of 1901, cemetery caretakers found a body lying right here, right next to this area, with a revolver. Just moments earlier, Charles Cornett walked through the same cemetery gates we were at in the beginning, walked over this way to his son's grave, and according to the coroner's report, placed a gun to his chest and shot himself right through the heart. They say his spirit still is often seen walking through those gates and coming over here by his son's grave. So I have a spirit box over here running, just in case anything comes through. But here is the news article of that day. Shortly before 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon, workmen found the body of a man lying near the grave, near the chapel in Charles Evans Cemetery. The man was about 48 years of age and was shot through the heart. He was well dressed. Lying alongside the body was a .48 caliber revolver containing 4 cartridges. 1 had been discharged. The man's vest was opened, and he apparently placed the revolver to his heart and fired. His clothing was burned and his flesh blistered. The body was removed to the morgue of Undertaker Aumann, and Coroner Moyer was notified. A search of the dead man's clothes was made, when papers were found which established his identity as Charles A. Cornett. The body was found near the grave of his son, James Cornett, a young man who died about 6 months ago after a brief illness. So while sitting here doing some of these spirit box sessions here, a couple of things came across. One of a woman saying sad, another of a man saying sad, and he also said hurt. And then as I was doing some intro for the cemetery over there, somebody had said, Now, somebody was interested in what I was saying. Thanks for watching the video of this little tour of Charles Evans Cemetery. There's a lot more here that's undiscovered. There's one grave I didn't find, which is over in this vicinity of a gentleman called Wild Bill, Canada Bill. He was an old card shark. He ended up here in Reading, ended up in the poorhouse in Berks County. A very interesting story. The day of his cemetery was the day of his funeral was also very interesting. So that's one other bit of information. But hope you enjoyed this, and if you liked it, like and subscribe, and I'll see you again. Thanks for watching.